Virgin stalked all night with the ruthless billionaire. She hates so much, but after one night together, everything changed. The elevator was supposed to take 30 seconds. Aria Callahan had counted on those 30 seconds, had needed them, to get from the 42nd floor of Wolf Tower down to the lobby, out through the revolving doors, and into the cold New York night before anyone noticed she'd stayed 3 hours past her shifts just to avoid him. The doors slid shut. She exhaled. And then the lights flickered. Once, twice, and died. The elevator groaned, a low, mechanical sound that felt almost apologetic, and lurched to a stop somewhere between the 31st and 32nd floor. The emergency lighting kicked on, bathing everything in a dim, amber glow that made the small space feel smaller, warmer. He liked the beginning of something she didn't have a name for yet. Aria pressed herself against the back wall, fingers gripping the brass railing, and told herself to breathe. She was fine. Elevators stopped all the time. Maintenance would have it running in minutes. She would be home by 10. She would make her tea. She would forget this entire day ever happened. Then the doors at the other end of the lobby, the ones that opened from the private executive corridor, slid apart, and Damian Wolf stepped in. He didn't look up immediately. He was still reading something on his phone. Dark brows pulled together, jaw set in that particular way that made his entire face look carved from something harder than bone. He wore a charcoal suit, no tie, the top button of his white shirt undone like even his clothes were tired of performing for people. His dark hair was slightly disheveled, the first imperfect thing about him she'd ever noticed. He looked up. Their eyes met. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Aria had ever heard. Callahan, his voice was low, even, the way a man speaks when he's already decided the situation doesn't deserve his surprise. Mr. Wolf. Hers was quieter, steadier than she felt. He looked at the frozen elevator panel, then at her, then at the panel again, as though it might offer him a more acceptable explanation for why this was happening. It didn't. Damian slid his phone into his pocket and said nothing. He simply moved to the opposite corner of the elevator, as far from her as the space would allow, which she noted with grim irony, and it was approximately 4 feet, and leaned his shoulder against the wall with the practiced calm of a man who had survived boardroom wars and hostile takeovers, and apparently considered a stuck elevator to be a mild inconvenience at best. Aria stared at the doors. She had worked as a junior architect at Wolf Developments for 11 months, 3 weeks, and she could calculate the days of Prest, roughly 4 days. In that time, she had spoken directly to Damian Wolf exactly 6 times. She remembered each one with the kind of precision that embarrassed her. The first, her interview, where he'd barely looked at her portfolio before approving her hire, which she'd found insulting. The second, a meeting where he'd cut her mid-sentence to redirect the room, which she'd found infuriating. The third through 6th, variations of the same pattern. Him, decisive and immovable. Her, trying not to let her feelings show on her face and failing at least twice. She did not like Damian Wolf. She had decided this early and held it with both hands like something she couldn't afford to put down. What she had never accounted for was being stuck in a box with him at 11 o'clock at night with no signal, no rescue timeline, and the slow, creeping awareness that this amber light was doing something completely unreasonable to the angles of his face. She looked away. "Do you have signal?" she asked, because silence felt more dangerous than conversation. He checked. "No." "The emergency line, already pressed it, they're aware." He paused. "It'll be a while." "A while." She turned the words over. "How long is a while?" "Power outage. Half the block." He didn't look at her when he said it. "Could be a few hours." Aria said nothing. She absorbed this information with the quiet dignity of someone who had been handed a situation they absolutely did not choose and were absolutely not going to cry about. A few hours. Alone. With him. She set her bag down carefully and sat on the floor of the elevator, back straight against the wall, knees together, because if she was going to be trapped, she was at least going to be comfortable. She pulled out the folded site drawings she'd been meaning to review and smoothed them across her lap, determined to be productive, determined to be unbothered, determined to be everything she always was. Composed, contained, unremarkable in her feelings. She felt him look at her. "You're going to read," he said. It wasn't a question. And it wasn't quite amusement either. It was something in between, something she didn't have a file for. "I have work," she said simply. A beat. "Of course you do." And for the first time in 11 months, 3 weeks, and however many days, Arya Callahan heard something in Damien Wolfe's voice that she had never caught before. Not coldness, not authority. Something tired. Something almost... She didn't finish the thought. She looked down at her drawings instead and told herself firmly and with great conviction that the next few hours would be completely, entirely, and absolutely fine. She was wrong, of course, but she didn't know that yet. Dearest viewers, have you ever been stuck somewhere with the last person you expected and felt something shift that you couldn't quite explain? Keep watching, because what happens in this elevator will change everything. Arya Callahan had learned early that the quietest person in the room was usually the most dangerous one. She'd grown up the second daughter of a woman who filled every silence with noise. Laughter, arguments, music. The particular chaos of a household that ran on, feeling first and thinking second. Her older sister Bree was the same way. Loud in her love, loud in her anger, loud in everything she did. Arya had watched them both from a careful distance her entire childhood, quietly convinced that emotion, when worn too openly, became a wound that other people could find. So she'd learned to fold hers inward. She was good at her job because of it. Architecture rewarded precision, clean lines, structures that held their shape under pressure. She understood those things in her bones, and she poured everything she couldn't say out loud into the drawings she made. Buildings that were beautiful without trying to be, functional without being cold. Her colleague and closest friend, Mara Chen, once told her that her designs looked like someone trying to hug you without admitting they wanted to. Arya had told her that was the most ridiculous thing she'd ever heard. She thought about it for 3 days afterward. She was 26, talented enough to have landed a position at one of New York's most prestigious development firms on her second application, and careful enough to have spent nearly a year there without drawing unnecessary attention. She had a small apartment in Brooklyn with a leaky faucet she kept meaning to fix. A plant named Gerald who was thriving despite her inconsistent watering schedule, and a quiet, structured life she had built with both hands and intended to keep exactly as it was. She did not have a history of reckless decisions. She did not have a pattern of reading too much into things. She was, by every reasonable measure, a woman who knew exactly where the lines were and stayed well behind them, which was why sitting on the floor of a stopped elevator across from Damien Wolfe, pretending to read architectural drawings she hadn't absorbed a single line of, felt like standing at the edge of something she couldn't see the bottom of. She turned a page she hadn't read. Damien Wolfe had been described in various publications as the following: ruthless, visionary, emotionally unavailable, the most dangerous man in New York real estate, and in one particularly creative piece from a lifestyle magazine he'd immediately stopped accepting interviews with, a man who looks like he was assembled by someone who wanted to punish the rest of us. He'd found that one almost funny. Almost. He was 34, the only son of Richard Wolfe, who had built the company from raw ambition and passed it to Damien along with a set of expectations so heavy they'd reshape the way he walked through a room. Shoulders back, eyes forward. No hesitation visible, ever, because hesitation was the first thing predators in this industry smelled. He had learned to be unreadable. He had learned it so thoroughly for so long that there were moments, quiet ones like this, when he wasn't entirely sure what he actually felt versus what he had simply trained himself not to show. He was aware, in the way that someone with his instincts was always aware, that Arya Callahan was pretending to read those drawings. She hadn't turned the page in 11 minutes. He had not been counting. He was simply observant. It was a professional skill. It had nothing to do with the way the amber light had settled over her like it was comfortable there, like it had found the right place to rest. He shifted his weight and looked at the ceiling. His assistant Marcus would be trying to reach him. His 7 a.m. board call tomorrow needed final preparation. There were 3 contracts sitting on his desk that he hadn't signed, a development proposal for a waterfront property that was either his best acquisition of.
If you're enjoying the story so far, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. It really helps the channel grow and lets me keep bringing you more amazing love stories. All right, back to the story.
The year, or an elegant mistake, and approximately 47 other things that required his attention before morning. Instead, he was here. He let out a slow breath through his nose and said nothing. The first 20 minutes passed in a silence so structured it almost had architecture. Arya arranged hers around the drawings. Damien maintained his with the casual authority of a man who had never needed to fill space with words. Outside, somewhere far below, the sounds of New York continued. Sirens, a car horn, the low, persistent hum of a city that didn't notice or care that two people were suspended between floors with nowhere to go. It was Arya who broke first, not because she wanted to, because her stomach did. The sound was small, completely involuntary, the specific betraying rumble of someone who had worked through dinner for the third time this week because a deadline was more real to her than hunger. She closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, Damien was looking at her, not unkindly, not with the cool dismissal she'd cataloged from their previous interactions, with something more neutral than that, something that looked unexpectedly like recognition. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and produced, without ceremony, a wrapped protein bar. He held it out toward her like it was a document transfer. Arya stared at it. "I'm fine," she said. "I know," he said. "Take it anyway." She looked at the protein bar. She looked at him. She performed a rapid internal calculation that involved her pride on one side and the very real evidence that her body had opinions, and took it. "Thank you," she said quietly. He nodded once and returned his gaze to the middle distance, as though the exchange had not happened, as though they were colleagues passing in a hallway, not two people sharing a protein bar on the floor of a broken elevator, somewhere between the 31st and 32nd floor of a building that felt increasingly like it was conspiring against her. She unwrapped it. Dark chocolate and almonds. Of course it was. She ate it in small, dignified bites and did not acknowledge that it was exactly what she would have chosen herself. "You stayed late," he said. 20 minutes after the protein bar. 20 minutes of silence so complete she'd half convinced herself he'd forgotten she was there. She looked up. "I had revisions. The Meridian Project." It wasn't a question. She felt something tighten. Not defensively, but the particular alertness of someone who suddenly realized they were being paid closer attention than they thought. "Yes, your proposed facade adjustment." He paused. As it was the right call. Arya held very still. In 11 months, Damien Wolf had not once, offered her an unsolicited opinion on her work that wasn't a redirect or a correction in a meeting. She had assumed he barely registered her contributions beyond their appearance on the project sheets. She didn't know what to do with this information. "The committee pushed back," she said carefully. "The committee is wrong." Simply, flatly, with the absolute authority of someone who did not experience self-doubt about architectural judgment or, apparently, most other things. The load-bearing concern was addressed in the revised specs. They didn't read past page 4. She blinked. "You read the revised specs. I read everything that comes through this firm. She stopped, reorganized. "I didn't know that." He looked at her then, now directly, with those dark eyes that she'd always found unsettling for reasons she'd never examined too closely. "Most people don't." The silence that followed was different from the ones before it. It had a different texture, less like a wall, more like a door that had been left slightly, accidentally ajar. Arya looked down at her drawings. She was definitely not going to think about that. It was Mara who had warned her, back in the early weeks of her hire, delivered over coffee in the break room with the efficient gravity of someone sharing classified intelligence. "Don't let him get in your head, Ari. He's brilliant, yes. He's also the kind of man who doesn't let people close, and has probably never once in his life said the words, 'I was wrong,' without it physically hurting him. Be professional, be excellent, be invisible." Arya had taken this advice seriously. She had held it carefully. She believed, followed it faithfully. Except for the part, the small, poorly lit part of her she didn't examine, that had noticed from the very first meeting that Damian Wolf was the most unsettlingly present person she had ever been in a room with. Not because he was loud, because he wasn't, because he watched and listened and processed in a way that made you feel simultaneously seen and assessed, and she had never, not once, been able to tell which column she landed in for him. She found that infuriating. She found him infuriating. She was going to keep finding him infuriating, even if he'd read her revised specs. Even if he'd handed her a dark chocolate protein bar without making it strange. When even if the amber light in the quiet, in the strange outside of time quality of a broken elevator was making it harder than usual to remember all the very sensible reasons she kept her distance. She pressed her back straighter against the wall. She was completely in control. "You hate this," Damien said. She looked up sharply. "Excuse me?" "Being stuck." He nodded at the space around them. "You hate not being able to leave." She considered denying it. She considered a polite deflection, something smooth and professional that would close the conversation cleanly. Instead, without quite deciding to, she told him the truth. "I prefer knowing the exits," she said. Something shifted in his expression. Small, brief, the way a shadow crosses a wall, there and then gone. "So do I," he said. And for the first time in 11 months, 3 weeks, and however many days, Aria Callahan looked at Damian Wolf and felt, with quiet, inconvenient certainty, that there was something underneath the surface of him she had never thought to look for. She wasn't sure that was a safe thing to know. The power came back on at 11:47 p.m. For exactly 4 seconds, the lights flooded the elevator. Harsh, fluorescent, merciless after the soft amber. And Arya blinked against it, and the panel flickered to life, and she felt the whole structure shudder like it was preparing to move. And she thought, finally this is over. I can go home and never think about this again. Then the lights died again. The elevator made a sound she could only describe as resigned. The amber returned. Arya stared at the panel. The panel offered nothing. From the corner, Damien looked at his watch, said nothing. And the particular quality of his silence had shifted over the past hour. It was less armored than it had been at the beginning, less like a boundary and more like a habit he hadn't consciously decided to maintain. She noticed this the way she noticed structural things, quietly, precisely, without announcing it. His phone buzzed. He looked at it. A text had come through in the brief window of returning power. She could tell from the way his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Everything all right?" she asked, because she was polite and because she wasn't entirely sure she'd stopped herself in time. He looked up. "My brother," he said, then as though the word had surprised him on its way out. "He's in town." She hadn't known Damian Wolf had a brother, she realized sitting on the floor of this elevator, and that she knew almost nothing about Damian Wolf that wasn't professional, filtered, deliberately offered for public consumption. The bio on the company website, the Forbes profile from 2 years ago that Mara had sent her as a warning document. The way he ran a meeting, decisive, economical, impossible to redirect once he'd made up his mind. Nothing underneath any of that. "Older or younger?" she asked. He seemed to consider whether to answer. "Younger. By 4 years." A pause. "He thinks dropping in unannounced is charming." "Is it?" The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, more like the ghost of one, the outline of what a smile might look like on a face that hadn't practiced in a while. "No." Arya filed this away in a place she wasn't naming. At midnight, the emergency line crackled to life. A tired, but an apologetic voice informed them that the outage was broader than initially assessed. A transformer issue 2 blocks over. Crews were working. Estimated restoration, another 2 to 3 hours, possibly longer. The elevator was confirmed stable. The emergency ventilation was functioning, and they were advised to stay calm and conserve their phones. 2 to 3 hours. Arya absorbed this with a stillness that cost her more than it showed. She had been in this elevator for over an hour already. Her legs were beginning to feel the floor. The architectural drawings had stopped being a useful prop approximately 40 minutes ago. and the carefully maintained professional distance she kept between herself and Damian Wolf was being quietly, systematically, undermined by every small thing that had happened since the lights went out. The protein bar, the revised specs, so do I. And she didn't know what to do with any of it, except hold it very still and hope it didn't move. Damien, to his credit, took the news with the same composure he took everything. He loosened his cuffs, rolling each sleeve up once methodically, without looking up, and lowered himself to the floor. Arya watched this happen. Damien Wolf, on the floor of an elevator, jacket folded beside him with the careful precision of someone who treated even inconvenience with structure. He caught her looking. She looked away first. "You can say it," he said. "Say what?" "Whatever you're thinking." She kept her eyes on the doors. "I'm not thinking anything." "Callahan." There was something in the way he said her name. Not unkind. Not sharp, just direct in a way that made deflection feel more effort than it was worth. "You've had an opinion since I walked into this elevator. I'd rather you said it than whatever this is." She looked at him then. Straight on, the way she rarely let herself. His sleeves were rolled to the forearm, his jacket beside him, and he looked, in the amber light at midnight on the floor of a stopped elevator, startlingly human in a way she hadn't prepared for. "I think," she said carefully, "that you're not used to situations you can't control." A beat. "No," he agreed, "I'm not. And I think it bothers you more than you're showing." He considered this. "Probably. And I think—" She stopped. "Go on." She shook her head. "That's enough." He didn't push, but he didn't look away either. And the space between them, 4 feet, approximately, she had not stopped knowing this, felt different than it had an hour ago. Less like opposite ends of a professional arrangement, and more like 2 points on a map that kept recalculating the distance between them. It was her sketchbook that changed things. It had slipped from her bag when she'd reached for her water bottle. A worn, navy blue sketchbook she'd carried for 2 years, filled with the drawings that weren't for projects, personal ones, buildings she'd never been commissioned to design, spaces she'd imagined for no reason except that her mind made them when it was left alone. It landed spine up between them. She reached for it at the same moment he did. Their hands didn't touch. They came close. Close enough that she felt the proximity of it, or the almost, and then she had the sketchbook, and he had withdrawn his hand, and they were both looking at each other with the careful blankness of two people pretending a moment hadn't just happened. "Sorry," she said, pulling it back. He said nothing, but his eyes had caught the open page, a detailed sketch of a building she'd designed entirely in her head, organic curves meeting rigid structure in a way that shouldn't have worked and somehow did. "That's yours?" he said. "It's personal." "I know. Is it yours?" She hesitated, then, "Yes." He looked at it for a moment longer than was strictly casual. "The tension between the structural grid and the organic shell," he said slowly. "That's deliberate." It wasn't a question. She felt something move in her chest, something small and inconvenient. "Yes. Most architects pick a side." "I know." "You don't." "No." She looked down at the drawing. "I think the most interesting structures are the ones that hold both, the rigid and the soft, the planned and the unexpected." She paused. "They're harder to build, but they last longer." The silence that followed was not empty. Damien looked at her, really looked at her, with the kind of attention she recognized from his boardroom focus, except this was different. In the boardroom, that attention was strategic. Here, in the amber light, at 10 minutes past midnight, it felt like something else entirely, like he was recalibrating something he'd previously filed incorrectly. "You've never shown these to anyone at the firm," he said. "They're not for the firm." "Why not?" She met his eyes. Because some things aren't for work." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked away, and she saw something move through his profile. Something she couldn't name, something that looked like it had been very carefully managed for a very long time. "No," he said quietly. "I suppose they aren't." She didn't decide to ask the next question. It arrived without warning, the way honest things sometimes did when the hour was late, and the space was small, and the usual structures had gone soft around the edges. "Do you like it?" she said. "The work." He turned to look at her. "Genuinely," she added. "Not the results, not the deals, the work itself." He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might redirect, might pull back into the professional remove she was used to. While she watched him almost do it, watched something in his expression gather toward closure, and then, inexplicably, watched it stop. "I used to," he said, "when I was choosing it." A pause. "It's different when the thing you chose becomes the only thing you're allowed to be." Arya was quiet. She understood that. Not in the same architecture. Her life was smaller, her pressure different. But the shape of it. The way a thing you love can become a cage if you're not careful. "What would you do?" she asked. "If you could choose again?" He didn't answer immediately, and when he did, it was quiet enough that she almost missed it. "I don't know," he said. "I stopped letting myself think about it." The admission sat between them, unguarded, unretracted. She didn't fill it with anything. She just let it be there, on it, which felt like the most respectful thing she could offer. Somewhere around 1 in the morning, Arya's back protested the wall for the last time, and she shifted, stretching her legs out in front of her, rolling her shoulders. The movement was involuntary, unstudied, and it was the most natural thing that had happened in this elevator all night, which was somehow the most disarming thing of all. Damien watched her from the corner of his eye. He had been watching her in the periphery of himself for the better part of an hour. Not the way he watched things in a room, strategically for information. Something less calculated than that. Something he didn't have a clean professional category for. She had pushed back on him, not aggressively, not performatively, with a quietness that had more precision than most people's arguments. She had answered his questions directly, asked her own without apology, and when he'd said something that surprised her, she hadn't pretended otherwise. Just absorbed it, recalibrated, continued. He found to his considerable discomfort that he had no idea what she was going to say or do next. He couldn't remember the last time that had been true of someone. She pulled one knee up to her chest, rested her arm across it, and turned to look at him, unhurried, unapologetic. "Tell me something true," she said. He looked at her. "About what?" "Anything." A small pause. "Something you don't usually say out loud." It was an extraordinary request. He was aware of this. He was also aware that the hour and the amber light and the strange, suspended quality of this evening had created conditions that did not resemble any he'd operated in before. Told me, which was perhaps why he answered instead of deflecting. "I haven't slept more than 5 hours in approximately 3 years," he said. "I don't know if that's a choice anymore or just what I am." Arya looked at him for a long moment. "That's not a life," she said, gently, without judgment. "No," he agreed. "It's not." She nodded slowly, and then, with the matter-of-fact grace of someone who had decided that honesty deserved to be met with honesty. "I haven't let anyone close in so long that I'm not sure I remember how," she said. "I tell myself it's because I'm careful, but I think mostly I'm just afraid." The confession sat in the air between them, unhidden. Damien looked at her, she looked back, and neither of them looked away. The city outside had no idea. That was the thing Arya kept returning to. In the stretched and quiet hours past 1 a.m., that 40 floors below, New York was doing exactly what it always did. Cabs cutting through intersections, diners open and fluorescent, someone somewhere laughing too loud on a sidewalk, the whole indifferent machinery of the city grinding forward without a single acknowledgement that up here, in this small amber-lit box suspended between floors, something was happening that she did not have a name for yet and was becoming increasingly convinced she needed one. She had stopped pretending to look at her drawings 40 minutes ago. She wasn't sure when that had happened. At some point, the sketchbook had replaced them, closed now, resting beside her, and the conversation had taken over the space that the silence used to occupy. Moving in quietly the way water moves into a room, not dramatically, just steadily, until you looked around and realized the floor was covered. "You mentioned the Meridian facade," she said, because they'd circled back to work the way people circle back to safe ground, and she'd let it happen because the alternative was staying in the territory they'd just been in, which was beautiful and terrifying, and she needed a moment to breathe. What actually made you read that far into the specs? Damien turned his head toward her. He'd shifted position at some point in the last hour. No longer squared against the wall, one knee bent, arm resting across it. More at ease than she'd ever seen him. It looked good on him in a way she was not going to spend time thinking about. The original design was competent, he said. Yours was better. That's not what I asked. A pause. No, John, it isn't. He looked at the ceiling briefly. Thorpe flagged it in a meeting summary. Said the junior team had submitted a revision that complicated the timeline. Something moved through his expression. I read it because anything Thorpe calls complicated is usually someone doing something right that he doesn't understand. Arya absorbed this. You don't trust Thorpe's judgment. I trust his organizational skills. His architectural instincts are, he paused, limited. She bit the inside of her cheek to keep from smiling. She had worked under Thorpe for 11 months. She had composed in the privacy of her own mind an extensive and well-supported opinion of his architectural instincts. That's very diplomatic, she said. I'm known for it, he said, completely dry. She did smile then, small, involuntary, and the kind that arrived before she could make a decision about it. She felt him notice it, not intrusively, not with comment, but the particular attentiveness of someone who has registered something and filed it in a place they intend to return to. She looked away first, which was becoming a pattern she was tracking with some concern. How did you end up in architecture? He asked. It was the kind of question that shouldn't have felt intimate and did, because he was asking about origin, about the thing beneath the career, and they had somehow in the past 2 hours moved into a register where that kind of question didn't feel like small talk. My grandmother's house, she said. She hadn't planned to say it, but it came out clean, unhesitant, the way true things do when the conditions are right. She lived in this old brownstone in Harlem, early 1900s. Every room had a different ceiling height, not by mistake, by choice. The architect had designed each space for a different quality of light. She paused. When I was 7, I asked my grandmother why the kitchen felt happier than the living room. She said it was because of the windows. I didn't understand it then, but I kept thinking about it. Damien was listening. Not politely, actually listening, with the quality of attention he gave things that he found genuinely interesting, which she was learning to distinguish from the performed attention he gave things he was managing. You wanted to know how a room could feel something, he said. She looked at him. Yes, exactly that. He nodded slowly, like a piece of information had just found its correct position. And you, she said, were architecture or development. Was it always going to be this? The pause before he answered was a specific kind, not evasive, but careful. The pause of someone selecting a truth from several available ones. My father built this firm, he said. I was never given the impression there was another option. But if there was, he looked at her sideways. You ask that a lot. You avoid answering it a lot. The corner of his mouth moved. Structural engineering, he said quietly. The math of why things hold, not the business of it, not the acquisition and the development. A pause. Just why things stay standing. She held that for a moment. There was something in it, something that felt like more than professional preference. Like a man who had spent his life being asked to build empires, quietly wondering about the physics of endurance. That makes sense, and she said, does it? Yes. She looked at him directly. You want to understand the thing underneath. What makes it stable? What keeps it from... She stopped. From collapsing, he finished. Their eyes held. The air in the elevator had changed temperature without either of them touching a thermostat. Arya looked down at her hands. Her heart was doing something she was choosing not to monitor too closely. Somewhere between 1:30 and 2 a.m., they ran out of work to hide behind. It happened gradually. The conversation moved. From the Meridian Project to architecture, generally to buildings they'd each found extraordinary to a debate. Unexpectedly heated for the hour and the setting. About whether the Guggenheim's interior actually functioned as a gallery or was simply a beautiful argument against paintings? Arya had opinions, strong, specific, well-reasoned ones. Damien disagreed with approximately half of them. He did this without condescension, which she found both surprising and disarming, because in a meeting he was immovable in a way that felt like dismissal. Here, in the amber light, he pushed back with genuine engagement, not to win but to test, to see what she'd do, to find the edges of her thinking and probe them with the focused curiosity of someone who found the architecture of her mind as interesting as the buildings she designed. She found this so profoundly inconvenient, she could have screamed. Instead, she told him he was wrong about the Guggenheim, backed it with 3 specific arguments, and watched him absorb them with an expression that was dangerously close to impressed. "You've thought about this for a long time," he said. "Since I was 19. She paused. "I wrote a paper on it. My professor said I was being contrarian." "Were you?" "No. I was being right. A beat. There's a difference." He looked at her for a moment, then, "Yes, there is." The validation landed somewhere she hadn't left open for it. She felt the warmth of it, brief and inconvenient, and folded it away before it could become something she had to address. It was the yawn that undid the last of the formality. Arya had been fighting it for 20 minutes, the particular exhaustion of someone who'd been running on purpose and adrenaline since 8 a.m., and had now been still for long enough that her body had remembered it was tired. So she pressed her lips together. She breathed carefully through her nose. She lasted another 4 minutes. Then it happened. Involuntary, complete, absolutely undignified. She covered her mouth immediately. Her eyes went to Damien. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Something between amusement and something softer. Something that had no business being on the face of Damien Wolfe at 2 in the morning in a broken elevator. "Don't," she said. "I didn't say anything." "You were going to." "I was simply observing that you're human after all," he said. "It's reassuring." She narrowed her eyes. "That's not a compliment. It wasn't meant to be an insult." "What was it meant to be?" He considered. "An honest observation." She looked at him for a moment. "Do you do that on purpose? Say things that technically aren't unkind, but somehow still land like a challenge?" Something shifted in his face. "Do you always analyze everything the moment it happens, or does that take time to develop?" She stopped. "That's deflection." "That's also an honest observation." She stared at him. He looked back. And then, without either of them planning it, without she suspected either of them having any idea it was about to happen, they were both quiet for a moment, and then both, simultaneously, almost laughed. Not quite. It didn't complete itself. But it was there. The shape of shared laughter, the outline of it, close enough that she felt the warmth of what it would have been. She pressed her lips together. He looked away. But the almost laugh sat between them, evidence of something neither of them had put there on purpose. She was asleep before she realized she was falling. Not dramatically. She didn't slump or fall sideways, nothing that required narration. She simply settled, inch by inch, into the particular stillness of someone losing consciousness against their better judgment. And at some point between one thought and the next, her head tilted and the world went soft. She woke 20 minutes later to the awareness that her head was no longer against the wall. It was against Damien Wolfe's shoulder. She came awake the way she always did, quietly, fully, without transition. And the first thing she registered was the warmth of him, the solidity, the fact that his breathing was even and slow, and he had not moved, and she had no idea how this had happened, and she was completely, entirely mortified. She started to pull back. His voice, a low and careful, "Don't." She stilled. "You'll wake up with neck pain," he said. Practical, unhurried. "We have at least another hour." She said nothing. She was performing a rapid internal assessment of every available option and finding each one more complicated than the last. "Callahan." His voice had something in it. Not authority, not the boardroom register. Something quieter, something she felt more than heard. "It's fine." She didn't move away. She told herself it was practical. She told herself it was because he was right about the neck pain. She told herself a number of very reasonable things that she only half believed, and she stayed where she was. and she felt his shoulder rise and fall with a slow breath, and she closed her eyes and told herself this didn't mean anything. In the small space between believing it and not, oh, she felt his posture, almost imperceptibly, almost not enough to mention, settle. Not shift away, settle. Like someone who had been holding themselves at a particular tension for a very long time and had for 1 hour in a broken elevator decided to put it down. She didn't say anything about it. Neither did he. Outside, the city continued. The crew somewhere in the building continued working. The night moved forward at its own pace, indifferent to the two people suspended between floors who had started the evening as adversaries and somewhere past midnight had become something they didn't have a word for yet. Something warmer, something that had been building. She could see it now, looking back. Since a protein bar and a sketchbook, and so do I, and tell me something true. She wasn't ready to name it. But she stopped telling herself it wasn't there. Dearest viewers, thank you for coming this far. Let's check out what happens next in part 2.